Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. We're glad to see you today. Oh, we can't see you. We're glad for you to listen to our voices today. That's what's really happening here. Thanks for joining us. Joining me today is my co-host, Dr. Scott Melson. Hello, sir.
What is up, man? How are you?
I'm well. Good to see you.
Likewise.
Were you here? Yeah, you were here last week. No, not last week.
Was I here last week? I think I was here last week. It was the week before I wasn't there.
That's right. All the days just run together. Well, anyway, regardless, good to see you. Bailey's not here this week. That's what we should say.
Bailey is out this week. One day, you know what? Maybe one day soon, we will all be here, and we can even record like in person. Like, how cool would that be?
That would be great. I think it would be more interactive, and we would have we could play off each other's body language in ways you can't do it on the computer.
Potting virtually is certainly something that can be done, but it's not the same.
It's not. And so that's a question for you as a physician. I'm not soliciting medical advice, but what's your perspective? I think about my daughter, Margot, right, who is 15 months old this weekend. No, today, actually. She's 15 months old today.
Happy birthday, Margot.
She doesn't listen to the pod. She doesn't. I will tell. I'll pass it along. But she spent her entire life in the pandemic and has been a witness and participant in quite a few Zoom calls and video conference calls of various sorts. And so I thought about the other day. I am someone who speaks with my hands a lot. I'm doing it right now for effect. But on video calls, I don't think people do it as much, right? So because everyone's typing while they're supposed to be having a conversation, and so I wonder if it is different for her when she sees people speaking in person, like how this will factor in. I'm sure I'm just going to answer my question, and I'll let you answer. But I'm sure over the lifespan it'll all be fine, right? Like she's got a few months in pandemic or a year, but then her big learning in school. Hopefully by then we're out of the woods and people are free to gesture about.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those things are right. I think it will definitely have an effect. I think it's also an effect that can be overcome. I mean, you and I have talked about before that I think that we're going to see, we've got this cohort of kids now that are kids that were born at the beginning of the pandemic, kids that are in kind of the 1, 2, 3-year-old range when at the beginning of the pandemic, and honestly even a little bit older, that have now spent this last year where their exposure to nonverbal communication and particularly like facial cues from people outside their immediate household has been really limited. And I think that that's going to absolutely have an effect on their communication skills, certainly when we immediately come out of the pandemic. Now, how permanent that will be, I don't know. But I do think that there's certainly reason to believe that we'll see an increased need for speech therapists in school, right? And of course, mental health providers as well. I mean, I can tell you right now, just from my own practice, my wife is a therapist. Other people that I talk to, I mean, the return to school, there's been a debate about when and how for kids to go back to school for several months now. And most places are back to school here in Oklahoma in some form or fashion. And that has been, on the one hand, I think there's agreement that the best place for kids to be for the most part is in school. However, it has had significant consequences on the mental health for a lot of these kids. I mean, kids that were already struggling with things like, depression or anxiety have had, worsening. Kids that haven't struggled with those things before are having issues. I mean, it's been, we are in for a really, I think we're in for a couple of years of and maybe longer of processing what this has been like for all of us, but especially for our kids. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And I think you're right. Things that might be overcome normally will just take a little bit longer, right? This happens, related to trauma and lots of things. It kind of pauses the developmental process, right? And so things are delayed, but it doesn't mean that they don't happen or, whatever over the long haul. Anywho, none of that has anything to do with Oklahoma politics, but it's a fun conversation for a couple of, healthcare junkies as well. Scott, this week in the state legislature was remarkably quiet compared to the last few weeks.
Yeah, I was just crazy busy this week and was not able to kind of keep up with as much as I usually try to. But I was kind of scrolling through and reading, and like, Sean uh, uh,
Ashley.
Ashley does his e capital early bird updates every morning at like 4 o'clock in the morning. And usually on Thursdays it's going to be like 15 tweets long, and there's like all this stuff happening. And I think today was 4 tweets. It was like, yeah,
Yeah.
they're about done. Gonna go home. Don't have a budget yet, and
Check back Monday.
yeah, see you Monday. So there
That's
wasn't.
twice this week. He had really short threads,
Yeah.
although I think one was due to connectivity issues. Yeah, so it has been we'll say a relatively quiet week, which in some ways I think just means like not a full on assault of democracy and maybe not as
I
contentious.
mean,
Although I saw Representative Andy Fugate today at the Oklahoma History Center, and somebody asked um, DHS Secretary Justin Brown, ask him how things are going with the session, and I heard Representative Fugate say, we've had just really weird battles with the other chamber this year. He's like, this has been unlike most years, and I thought that was, I don't know, it was somewhat unexpected to me. I know that they've had some debates and some challenges between the House and the Senate, but to hear it from someone on the inside about that strife, maybe I've missed it this year. In years past, we've seen the speaker and the pro tem like holding a not combative, but like back-to-back press conferences, right? Like when Senator Schultz was the pro tem in the Senate a few years ago, you would see Speaker McCall do a press conference, and then the pro tem would have a press conference, and the governor would have a press conference, and they all just were like trying to pass the buck to one another. We haven't seen it quite the same, but they've done it through the legislative process this year.
well, and I mean, they've not had press conferences, but they've definitely had some press releases, right? I mean, one of the things we talked about at the beginning of session was that Speaker McCall was wanting to do. I mean, I can't help but laugh when I say tax relief, because he at the beginning of session he was talking about, yeah, we really think this is a great time for tax relief, as though Oklahomans are like overtaxed by some measure, which is objectively, like, even if you want them to be lower, there's no objective measure by which Oklahomans are overtaxed, right? But then Senator Treat was like, "Yeah, no, we don't really think this is the time for that," and then in fact, like straight up declined to pass it. And so that was a big issue. There was the issue with healthcare reform. So the House passed a bill from Representative McIntyre that would essentially implement Sooner Care 2.0, which was what the governor had initially proposed for a possible way to do Medicaid expansion, and then kind of changed his mind. And then the Senate has, I think, thus far declined to even take that up. Right? Have they even? I don't think they've even voted on it at this point. It's never dead, but that doesn't bode well for the bill's prospects over there. Last session, the last couple of years, I feel like legislative season has been marked by the legislature fighting with the governor. But I do think that this year it's more accurate to say that the legislature is fighting with each other. The chambers are fighting with each other. Senator McCall had a bill that basically said, the state of Oklahoma via the Attorney General is allowed to declare any federal law that they want unconstitutional. And then Senator Treat modified that language and said that's actually not how it works. You can't just because you pass a law saying you can do that doesn't mean you can do that. And Speaker McCall was pretty irritated about that. So there's been some weird back and forth for sure.
Well, and I think they've also tried to put each other on the spot, right? So Senator Treat would amended one bill, so then Speaker McCall shucked another bill and sent it back to the Senate with language, and so like forcing them to vote on things that they didn't want to vote on once, much less twice. And it strikes me, I feel like some of this is like inside baseball trying to embarrass the other team in front of
The
both
three people who are
teams.
paying attention.
Right, right. Like you and I talk about this frequently that most Oklahomans, right, are not paying attention to what's happening with with like congressional leadership, much less the state house leadership, right? Like they don't give two shits if someone's bill didn't get heard and that made them pissy and so they didn't hear another bill, right? Those kinds of things happen all the time. And if it sounds like, sophomoric petty things, well, that's politics, right? But it also means, and this is, I think probably a relevant conversation, that that kind of behavior, those antics, often result in good bills just falling to the wayside, right? Things that would actually change, help, enhance life for Oklahomans get lost in the shuffle.
And it brings bad bills to light, right? So Senate Bill 2, which is the anti-trans bill that we spent quite a bit of time here talking on the show about. There was a thought there was a debate in the House caucus about whether or not that bill was even going to be heard, right? And my understanding is that leadership had decided that they weren't going to hear the bill for all of the reasons that the bill is terrible, right? But then that on that Monday is when Senator Treat changed the language of Senator McCall's bill about declaring laws unconstitutional, and so then House leadership put Senate Bill 2 on the floor, knowing it would pass, to send it back to the Senate and forcing them to deal with it, right? Like that was, and this is like, I mean, and that's a particularly egregious case because not only is it a bad bill, but it's like endangering trans teens, which are like already one of the most vulnerable populations from a health and mental health standpoint, and almost using them as like a political pawn because you're pissy about a law that's going to be declared unconstitutional anyway, right? Like,
Right.
So like not only do you see good bills get dropped, but you see bad and like dangerous bills get brought back as a messaging tool.
That's right. Yeah, as a political stick to beat your colleagues with. I was going to say opponents, but this also is the joke that is it from The West Wing where someone says
it's quoted in The West Wing, but I think it didn't come before that, where the new congressman shows up and is talking to an elder statesman from his party and says and says, well, I just one of the other side asked me to go to lunch, but I'm not going to go because I don't want to be seen cavorting with the enemy. And he says, son, the other side's not the enemy; they're the opposition. The enemy is the Senate.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, well, anyway, in just a matter of weeks, no more than 3 weeks from today, the legislature will be done. But Scott, you mentioned unconstitutional bills, and well, bills like Senate Bill 2 that will likely be ruled unconstitutional if they are challenged in court. And earlier this week, Carmen Foreman at the Oklahoman had a really interesting story, I think, about the noted history the legislature has here in Oklahoma of passing unconstitutional laws. And they even had a really great political cartoon explanation in the article that looks a bit like the Schoolhouse Rock "I'm Just a Bill" kind of graphics. And it shows how it happens when a bill gets challenged and is ruled unconstitutional and overturned. And so, as you might guess, listeners, the gist of the story, which I will link to in the show notes, but basically it says the number of bills that are unconstitutional and get challenged and ruled as such has been increasing in recent years. And then there's this really funny quote where it says, Republican leaders of the Oklahoma House and Senate said their chambers never knowingly advance unconstitutional bills because, of course, constitutionality is subjective, and the courts reviewing the legality of laws is part of the government's process of checks and balances, said House Speaker Charles McCall. Quote, the Oklahoma House constantly discusses constitutionality in the legislative process and never knowingly advances anything unconstitutional. Constitutionality is subjective and is why co-equal legislative, executive, and judicial branches have existed for checks and balances in Oklahoma and in democracies everywhere since ancient Greece.
Two things. They knowingly They knowingly advance unconstitutional legislation all the time. In the case of most of the abortion bills that they pass, knowing that they're unconstitutional, and they pass them so that they'll be challenged in a hope of overturning Roe v. Wade. So they pass unconstitutional bills knowingly all the time. Now they would say, no, those bills aren't unconstitutional. It's not our bill that's wrong. It's Roe, the decision in Roe that is wrong. That, I'm not a constitutional scholar. I'm not a scholar of Roe versus Wade. I've heard compelling legal arguments on both sides. However, I guess I would then like refer them back, like not that I'd tell them to go back to that part of the Constitution, which is not the amendments part, which is where they like to spend a lot of their time, but back to that part where it actually defines the roles. As it turns out, state legislators and state legislatures don't get to decide what's constitutional and isn't constitutional. It is subjective, but the people who get to rule on subjectivity are called the Supreme Court of the United States. And if they say something is constitutional or unconstitutional, that is in fact what goes, regardless of whether you agree with the decision or not. So,
Right.
so like, I mean, that's one of the things that just blows my mind is like, they'll say, well, the Supreme Court just passed this unconstitutional opinion. No, because the Supreme Court did it, it is by definition constitutional, right?
Right.
Like they get to make that decision. So that's point one. Point two, have co-equal legislative, executive, and judicial branches existed for checks and balances for like millennia since ancient Greece? I mean, like, was there a co-equal executive in ancient Greece? Like in Rome, like you had the Senate, and then you also had the what do you call it, the tribunes and the kind of bosses in Rome.
The emperor. Yeah.
Well, but I'm not even talking about the empire. I'm talking about the republic prior to the empire, right?
Yes.
But yeah, it's I read that sentence and I was like, I feel like that sounds like a very like learned sentence, but I think most of it's inaccurate. Like, I'm pretty sure most of it's wrong.
Charles, you make a good point, except I think you're wrong. Yeah, I'm not sure. I enjoy history as much as the next guy, I think, and but I haven't studied all democracy since then, and we, how do I phrase this? The ideal of co-equal branches, I think, is a ideal to which we aspire with this constant also co-equal attack on one another, right? Or at least perceived attack, where the legislature and the executive and in some cases the judiciary are trying to put off one or both of the other branches to try to trip them up. And maybe that's how none of them ever get ahead, is that it's like the Three Stooges, where they're just poking each other in the eyes and pulling their nose and stuff so that no one can get ahead.
So, like many things, a quick Google search yielded a plethora of information, and it turns out that the separation of powers as political doctrine actually has its origins in the writing of Charles de Songat, I don't know if you say that right, Baron de Montesquieu, in The Spirit of Laws. So rather than ancient Greece,
it's like the Enlightenment.
Yeah, so like 1750s.
So 15 years before America was formed. So yeah. This was a relatively new idea back then.
Yeah, I mean, no, I don't know if he was like a lot of people in the Enlightenment. I don't know. I don't know if he was looking back to the ancients for his inspiration. But it was apparently Montesquieu, not the first Grecian legislature, that came up with the idea for a separation of powers. So yeah, great quote. Apparently entirely incorrect on the part of Speaker McCall.
So I think this is a good segue. Scott, we're doing all right for not having a plan for this episode. We're just going to roll from one topic to another.
Just winging it.
We can weave them all in together, right? There was also a story this week in the Oklahoman, also from Carmen Foreman, about a new law. It was House Bill 2932, and it allowed it passed the legislature last week, and then the governor didn't sign it and he didn't veto it. And since we're in session, that means it's a pocket signature, right? So during session, the governor doesn't act on a bill that goes to his desk, then it becomes law without him actually approving it. And that's probably a appropriate response for this. So House Bill 2932, oh, excuse me, House Bill 2932 um, basically injects the legislature into um, CARES Act funding and any other federal stimulus related funding because they did not have a role. And as the Legislative Oversight and Fiscal Transparency Committee, LOFT, they put out a report earlier this year that basically showed a bunch of examples of undocumented, questionable spending from the executive branch. So, just to go back to our conversation about the legislature fighting against or coming at odds with the executive branch, I think this is a huge example where the governor, as the chief executive, had authority to spend this emergency money, and he did. And as is always the case, the legislature was like, hang on, well, we are the ones that have the power of the purse here, and we should be the ones to approve all this spending. Never mind the fact that they were not in session when this money came to be, and if this happens henceforth, right? So now that they do have the power to spend this money, or other stimulus money comes into the state, if they're not in session. So if it happens during the 8 months of any year when they're not in session, they would have to come back in session, get up to speed, and act. And in some cases, that could be weeks of time, right? It would be on their schedule, and that could result in a situation where the state is not as nimble, as responsive as they need to be, right?
Yeah. So I guess I would say, I mean, as we have a well documented history here on the show of of remarking on the fact that anytime there is money, if there is money that can be spent on things in Oklahoma, the legislature thinks that they are the only ones that should have any say in how those funds are spent, because as they love to remind people, they have the power of the purse. My understanding is that the power of the purse extends only to Oklahoma state funds. It does not extend to federal funds. At the federal level, Congress has the power of the purse, and Congress passed the CARES Act, and Congress delegated that $1.26 billion or whatever it was in CARES Act funding to come to Oklahoma, and they wrote the legislation in a way that gave the governor the power to spend it. So this was a case of the legislature, similar to the debate that we had about TSET funds. This is a case of the legislature seeing a big pot of money and thinking that they are the only ones who should be allowed to spend it, in large part because they think that will make their job easier by maybe decreasing what they have to appropriate in the regular session. At least that's my suspicion. None of them talked to me about it. I have mixed feelings about this. I feel like the problem that they identified was the right problem. I think this is the wrong solution. Yeah. Are there questions about how some of the CARES Act money was spent? Yes. Are there questions about some of the practices that were used to account for that money and kind of where it went and why? Absolutely. Is the answer to that to give that pantheon of transparency, the Oklahoma state legislature, the power over how those monies are spent in the future? In my opinion, no. In my opinion, it's to write legislation kind of codifying how the governor has to account for and maybe use federal funds like this when they're allocated in the future, right? Because your point is well taken that what was the right thing for them to do? Okay, we're going to call a special session. It's going to start in 2 weeks. And then they're going to come into session. They're going to gavel in. And then they're going to spend another 2 weeks bitching at each other about whether or not they can cut taxes based on this influx of $1.26 billion, right?
Right.
I mean,
well, and also just not to, sorry to cut you off, but like the legislative process of decision making is by nature a longer process, right? Like
As it should be.
right, the fastest they can go from introduction to final passage in the opposite chamber is 7 days, four
I mean, something
days.
like that. You got to have a first, second, third reading, and then you got to go to the other, and you got to have a first, second, third reading. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's like, I mean,
And
maybe
they
you
can't
can
all
get a,
happen the same day. Yeah.
yeah. And so, yeah, this is, like I said, I think that you know, I think that the problem is real, but saying that the fix is for the legislature to do it instead, um, and I mean, and that's like that seems to be the legislature's response to most problems is no. We should have that power. No.
That's right.
We should do that. No. That should be up to us. Uh,
Oh, I think it's important that we point out to listeners that the governor appointed a bipartisan committee, oversight committee of state legislators from both chambers and both parties for the purpose of providing input and overseeing how money was spent by the executive branch. And the report from Loft or whomever like basically acknowledges like, oh yeah, we know that you had a whole committee of us, but it wasn't enough. Like what you really need is more of us and less of you, right?
if you just go ahead and let us do it, that we'd really prefer if we just did it ourselves.
I do think that the fact that the governor just let this become law is evidence that he knew he didn't want to get into a fight, right? Like where if he vetoed it,
they had the votes to override,
right? And then that's just getting hit in the face for no reason, right? Like he might as well just take it and roll with it. But obviously he's not going to sign it because he's not like, I support this idea of restricting my power.
Senator Treat had a quote where he said, I think that the governor will be very open to legislative input in the future. And I was like, yeah, I bet he will be. Since he doesn't have a choice. But speaking of CARES Act mishaps, remember back in the day when hydroxychloroquine was all the rage and everybody thought that, and by everybody I mean people on Facebook thought that hydroxychloroquine was gonna like be the magic. I shouldn't say people on Facebook. There was a period at the beginning of the pandemic where there were some people were using hydroxychloroquine to try and treat the symptoms of COVID, and it was found not to be effective. That's not true. It was not just on Facebook. And at that time,
it's also on Parler.
At that time, no, there were. I mean, there were doctors and hospitals around the country, including here in Oklahoma, that were using hydroxychloroquine because this was this was the beginning when like we had no like. By the end of the pandemic, we had much better strategies about how to manage these people in terms of just treating symptoms and their respiratory status, right? Like what to do with their ventilator settings, what to do with their, what to do with like their airvo settings, like what to do with them in terms of fluid balance. Like we knew a lot more of that like at the end of the pandemic than we did at the beginning. So at that point, this was in like April or May of last year. We had purchased $2.6 million worth of hydroxychloroquine so that we would have a stockpile. I think that was shipped to a pharmacy in Prague, which I'm not 100% sure why it went out there. There's been, I know there's an article I have bookmarked to read about why the drug went to Prague, but I haven't read it yet. But it seems this is in the Tulsa World. Barbara Hobrock has a story today that we're going to get a refund. So we're sending the hydroxychloroquine back to those guys we bought it from, and we're gonna get our money back. So
the awkward part is it's like Amazon where you have to take it to Kohl's to do the return. I think we're gonna get 2 million Kohl's bucks. I think is how this is gonna work.
We get store credit for you. Yeah, and we'll get here's $2.6 million worth of hydroxychloroquine. You have a store credit. You can use it to buy 1 vial of insulin.
That's right. Just one vial. That's exactly right. But it has to stay cold, and you have to use it by Friday. Since we're talking about coronavirus and we're being irreverent, a little bit of good news is that as of this week, since our last, I guess since yesterday, probably, 1 million Oklahomans have completed the vaccine series, which is significant, right? Like we've given out more than, I mean, almost 3 million, I guess it's 2.7 million doses. But of all of that, the people, 100, or excuse me, a million, a little over a million people have completed the series, which is roughly 1 out of 4 Oklahomans, slightly more than that, close to 1 out of 3 Oklahomans, I think, has completed the series. So that's cautiously good news. Of course, cases are still happening. There was 234 or something, roughly around 200 cases today.
Yeah, our 7-day average is 175. We've got 190 people in the hospital. So these numbers are very similar to what we were seeing in roughly July of last year. The models that I have seen show us having another spike in late May into June, July. Not hopefully a spike on the order of what we've seen in the past, but a definite increase of cases from where we are now, with then a pretty steep tapering off to levels even below where we are now by August, September, and into the fall. So I think that's and that seems to be pretty consistent across several different models. So I think we should expect to see cases start coming up probably here in the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Which makes sense, since all the restrictions, masks, most citywide mask mandates were lifted this week in Oklahoma City and Tulsa.
And Stillwater.
Not in Stillwater?
Stillwater's got their mask mandate in place until, I believe, May 25th. So for the first and last time in my life, go Pokes.
It's Stillwater, a known bastion of radical liberals up there, right? But maybe it's appropriate because it is home to the Oklahoma Pandemic Center of Excellence, or whatever it's called. But seriously, I mean, 1 million people completed the series, plus the people who have some immunity from having the disease. Like, you and I think have exchanged articles this week. There was one for the New York Times on Monday, I think one from Vox on Tuesday. There were kind of two sides to that coin, right? The New York Times article was like, herd immunity is a myth. We're never going to get there. Everything is terrible. Good luck with your mask for the rest of your life. And then Tuesday, Vox was like, you know what? Like, it's closer than you think. Like, we may get there. And if you count everyone who's got vaccinated, everyone's had the disease, like, we may actually reach some kind of reasonable new normal.
So this, yeah. And I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. We'll see. I am really encouraged by the situation in Israel. The situation there is not 100% analogous to what we see in the U.S. for a variety of reasons. But I mean, they have had just staggering levels of success with their vaccine program. They've had really good public health measures in place, and they now have, I think, the lowest level of coronavirus of just about anywhere in the world. They've done a really incredible job after having a really significant outbreak of their own. So that gives me a lot of hope that as long as we can get enough people to get the vaccine, we will be able to get to kind of where we need to go. I don't think that so-called herd immunity is out of reach. Moderna, I think, this week has released preliminary data on a booster for one of the variants. I can't remember which one, but it appears to show similar efficacy and safety to the original vaccine for wild type virus. So that shows that even for these variants, we have the ability to get booster shots for those that work really well, and that should provide a further layer of protection. So this is not an insurmountable challenge. We just need everyone to do their part, which means, continuing to be careful in all the places that are appropriate, but also if you haven't got your vaccine, to get your vaccine. Pfizer has applied for full FDA approval, not just an emergency use authorization, but full FDA approval of their vaccine. They did that either today or yesterday. We'll very shortly be seeing, I think, emergency use authorizations for the vaccine in children, even younger than what we're seeing now. So we're so close, like we're there, and we can have, I think, a life that we had prior to COVID, but it's going to take a little bit more time. But the more that we all do our part, the faster that we'll get there.
Yeah, so maybe it makes sense then, with that in mind, to dream a little and to think about the future. And since this is a political podcast most of the time, um, but we've both worked in public health, let's continue to integrate these two and talk about what the future of politics in Oklahoma looks like and what the legacy of COVID is. Ooh, can we use the word legacy? Are we that far along in it yet?
That sound is my sphincters tightening.
This episode will henceforth be called "The Legacy of COVID-19," and so let's fast forward to a couple of key dates. One, this fall is when candidate filing is for next year. No, excuse me. This fall is when people have to be living wherever they're going to be living at the time that they file, and then filing I think is in March-ish, April-ish. And next year, as a reminder, listeners, all of the statewide offices are up for election: governor, lieutenant governor, school superintendent, inspector, auditor, the attorney general, the labor commissioner, the insurance commissioner, some corporation commissioners, all of these things, in addition to the entire state house and roughly half of the Senate, right? So this is, and the U.S. House, right? They'll all have new districts, and it's an exciting time in politics. So picture Oklahoma in a year from now, right? Everyone's filed. We're moving towards the primaries. Do you see COVID playing a significant role in campaigns next year? And let's answer those two ways, just for fun. Do you see COVID playing a role in the primaries? And did you see it playing a role in the general? Go.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think, and I don't think this is going to be unique to Oklahoma. Obviously, we're focused here, but yeah, I think this is going to be a role. I think politicians at every level are going to be touting their response to the pandemic, whether their response was strong and evidence-based on public health, or whether their response was the opposite of that, or kind of right that they see their non-response as a response, right? I think politicians are going to be touting that based on what they feel the folks in their district want to see, right? Governor Stitt consistently resisted calls for a statewide mask mandate. There were a lot of people that were very critical of him for that, particularly in our biggest metro areas. However, there were a lot of people in what I think has become his base, which is more rural Oklahoma, who were very skeptical about the need for a mask mandate, the constitutionality of the mask mandate. And I have absolutely no doubt that in either the primary or the general election, for the gubernatorial race or for any other race in which he may run, I have no doubt that Governor Stitt is going to feature the fact that he didn't implement a mask mandate. He's going to feature the fact that he, quote, opened Oklahoma up for business earlier than any other state in the country against the advice of public health experts. And I think that he'll wear that as a badge of honor, right? He's going to point to the current state of our virus. He's going to point to the current state of our economy and our unemployment. And he's going to say, see, everything is good now. And that's fine. And that shows that what I did was the right call, casually ignoring the months of December, November, and January, where we had 2,000 people in the hospital and not enough airvo machines to go around, right? He's not going to talk about those 3 months. He's going to talk about how things are now and how they were in June, when he said, everybody can kind of do their own thing. He also, I think, is going to ignore the fact that the two largest metro areas had mask mandates in place for most of this time, right? Not all of it. I think we should have and could have done it earlier, but Oklahoma City and Tulsa eventually did get mask mandates in place, right? I think as a counterexample to that, I think you'll see Mayor Holt in his reelection campaign emphasize his support of mask mandates and his support of listening to public health experts for guidance. So yeah, I think that you will see COVID on the ballot in any number of ways. I think COVID was on the ballot this past November. I think what'll be interesting to see is how short of a memory do we have, right? Right now there's a big debate. I won't get too much into this, but there's a big debate among congressional leadership for the Republican Party in the U.S. House of Representatives having to do with our Representative Liz Cheney from Wyoming versus Elise Stefanik, who is from New York and might replace her. And this has to do with the November election and the riot on January 6th and their varying responses to that. And I mean, this was 5 months ago, right? Right. And people are acting like in that conversation that the January 6th riot like never happened. Like, and we should just move on. We shouldn't even talk about it anymore. And I'm not trying to like wade into that debate, but like, are we going to, when we talk about COVID in the next election cycle, are we going to remember how bad it got and how much worse it even could have been?
Right. So I suspect that voters, candidates and voters will weight COVID proportional to how much they cared about it at the time, right? So largely Republicans who were more dismissive of COVID in general and of precautions like masks, those candidates are going to talk about it less because it wasn't as big of a deal to them, right? And their voters are going to care about it less. And so I think this is probably an illustration of some of that self-sorting and how candidates speak to their base and ignore the other side. And when it comes down to persuadable voters, right? So those undecideds that are in the middle, I think there's a calculus that candidates are going to have to pay very close attention to, because I think Democrats are going to try to make a bigger deal about COVID and COVID response, and Republicans are going to downplay it and maybe ignore it and talk about other things like economic factors. And when you look at the voting population, the public for a jurisdiction or the state, you've got to know what your voters care about. And if most of your voters don't care about COVID, if they didn't care about it now and they're not going to care about it in a year from now, then you're wasting your breath and you are not going to resonate with them, right?
Yeah, so I was going to say pushback, but that's not even the right word. Like, you're talking about persuadable voters and you have to kind of like watch yourselves, and maybe the audience is different from a primary versus a general. I mean, is it though? Like, is it that much different of a universe, right? I mean, because you know the map situation better than just about anybody else. I would submit they patched the maps this week. How many competitive districts do we have, like, in this next round?
Right. No,
right.
And
so I think to the extent they talk about COVID, I guess the way I would say it is they're going to be speaking to their primary voters because those are the only ones that are going to matter.
Right. Yeah. For the primary, especially. Like I would say I will be surprised if we hear much about COVID in the Republican primary race, right? With the exception of more conservative candidates are going to try to ding less conservative candidates, right? If they were supportive of mask mandates, right? They will try to shame them into being like, this guy wore a mask for 98 days, right? Like those kinds of things.
I think that's 100% going to happen, but I think it will be wide. I could be wrong. I think it will be widespread.
Yeah. Well, I don't. So I guess another way to say it is I don't think any Republican candidate, certainly not for the state legislature and not for statewide office, are really going to tout their COVID response as a reason to reelect them, right? Governor Stitt will talk about it, but he's not going to talk about a healthcare response necessarily. He's going to talk about an economic response.
Yeah. So I guess I would say, I think they're all going to tout their COVID response, but I'm including in their response the things that they didn't do. Right.
Oh, right.
Like, so that's what I think Governor Stitt is going to talk extensively about his COVID response and the fact that his response was to not do all of the things that doctors and scientists, like, he's going to tout the fact that doctors and scientists and epidemiologists said, oh, you should do X, Y, and Z. And his response was to say, no, thank you.
Right. So, and you referenced Mayor David Holt a minute ago. Listeners, if you don't already know, Mayor Holt is running for re-election for mayor, which means he's not running for governor. which makes a ton of sense. One, I think he genuinely loves being mayor. He's wanted to be mayor for a very long time. And two, he has zero chance of getting out of the primary for governor, right? Like this is the situation: is that anyone, if you're a Republican mayor of a city in a red state, if you're running for statewide office, you might get the vote of Republicans in your city if they supported you, but you're not all of them, right? You're going to have some that don't like you, and you're surely not going to get the vote from people in rural areas. And so I think this cycle we will see a continuance of extremism, maybe from both sides, right? Like a drifting towards the fringe on both sides, as I think candidates and maybe voters feel like there's less reason to compromise. I think that's fair.
Yeah, I agree. We're kind of nearing the end of our time here today, I think. One thing I did want to point out, this came out yesterday. I thought this could be an episode title, but we're only going to spend like a couple minutes on it, so maybe not. We've got 26 pages of badness today. It could be an episode title or the name of your favorite high school garage band. Maybe that was, or I could say my first term paper in college was 26 pages of badness. The state multi-county grand jury has issued an interim report in their investigation of Epic charter schools. They are not done with their investigation, but they issued this report because they said, due to the lack of transparency in accounting for the funds, an intentional avoidance of disclosure of information by a private entity, and a lack of cooperation, the investigation is unable to be completed at this time. So basically they're saying, because we think they're lying to us and they won't cooperate with the investigation, we don't have findings yet. But here is what we have noted. You can get the report. It's publicly available. A couple of things that I would note, and also most of the major news outlets have articles on this today. As usual, I am a big fan of NonDoc, and they have a great piece on it. They go through kind of all the entities involved and like what they're looking at, and a little bit of the history of Epic charter schools. I really think it's worth a read. They say that there's really several overriding concerns that have emerged during this, and they summarize them as these are not my words: a lack of oversight, a lack of transparency in operations, and a lack of accountability by the for-profit company Epic Youth Services, which is the educational management system or educational management organization that Epic contracts with to kind of run their stuff. One of their main concerns is that Epic Youth Services, this management organization, are the ones who actually created Epic public schools, right? Epic charter schools, which is kind of backwards, right? They're essentially the multi-county grand jury is alleging that rather than a group of concerned parents and teachers and community members seeing the need for a charter school and creating a charter school and then going and finding Epic Youth Services and saying, hey, will you run our school? The two guys that founded Epic Youth Services said, hey, you know what? We could make an education management company, and then we could start a charter school, and then we could get the contract to run the charter school, and then we could get 10% of all the funds that come into that charter school, which 10% of the nearly $500 million that have gone to Epic since 2015 is a lot of damn money. The quote that really gets me here, the public has not been served by the incestuous relationship between the for-profit vendor Epic Youth Services and the governing board community strategies. The system has failed to provide accountability and allowed a company to take advantage and generate a substantial personal profit on the backs of Oklahoma students. That is not the only time that they use the word incestuous in the report. It's delightful.
Delightful. That's rough stuff, man. That's anytime I think that you use the word incestuous in a grand jury paper, even if it's 26 pages of badness, I guess that makes it 26 pages of badness, but that's some heavy-handed wordsmithing there. And I think you got to admit, it's a little genius, maybe evil genius, right? But to come up with this plan and to say, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're going to We're going to create a business, and then we're going to create a school, and then we're going to funnel the money through the school into the business, and then we can keep some of the money, or the other way around. We can funnel the money through the business into the school, and we can keep some of that money with literally no oversight or even insight into what happens with that. That sounds like a sound business plan until a grand jury is looking into what you're doing, right? I feel like I've been watching The Wire recently, and I feel like this was I'm in like season 4 right now, and I think a similar plan existed between some of the drug dealers and how they were going to siphon money off the top of their operations.
Yeah, I mean, the report, I say it's 26 pages, and it is, but it's double spaced, and it's not that annoying legal size paper that we discussed last week. So I read it in about 30 minutes. It's really, I would go to NonDoc. They've got the report in the article. It's worth a read because it really is just like, how is this allowed? Like, and it's like these two guys that have made $50 million off this in the last 6 years.
Yeah, well, maybe it's not going to be allowed for very much longer, right? Like they've already been like, hey, sorry, we'll change how we're doing it, and that kind of lets you know that they got caught, right? It's like when you walk in and your kids are doing something they're not supposed to do, and you're like, what are you doing? They're like, nothing, and then they immediately clean up whatever mess they hide the markers and they try to wipe it off, and you're like, okay, well, you just clearly identified yourself as guilty here, man. Like the other day I walked in on my daughter and she was coloring on her chair in her room, like at her desk, with a red marker, and had it all over her hands. And I was like, I can't believe I literally caught her red-handed. This is fantastic. She didn't get the reference, but I was very excited.
That's awesome.
All right. On that note, let's wrap it up for today. Scott, thanks for being here.
Hey man, I've missed a few recently. Hopefully not another one for a while. So
that's all right. Hey, everyone's gonna take a day off every now and then. That sounds great. Says the guy who's been up till 2 a.m. the last 2 nights working. Hey, listeners, take a break this weekend. Get out, enjoy the nice weather. It's supposed to be almost 90 degrees this weekend. I'm not ready for that. But garbage. Remember that decisions are made by those who show up. Don't forget, there's an election in just next week, I think. If that's you, be sure to check the election board website, elections.ok.gov, and make sure you get out and cast your vote. Other than that, folks, have a great weekend.